Good morning. I'm going to start because we have an hour together, and I want you to get your full CLE credit. I'm Katie Mercer from Case Western Reserve, as you well know, because you signed up for this. We're going to talk about globalization and negotiating behavior and cross-cultural communication and how it affects both negotiations and mediations. And I'm going to do quite a bit of talking, but I hope that we have a little time to get to an exercise that I brought with me. So we'll see if we do. Maybe I'll talk fast. So globalization is here to stay, right? It's the increase of working relationships among national entities and international entities. It's also the mobility of capital across the globe with a powerful impact on national economies. It's increasingly a part of every person's normal life, particularly with the iPhone and the Samsung and all that, as we watch what is developing around the world. Whether you're a lawyer that is an inside or outside counsel to a major global corporation or a nonprofit organization, or an individual with legal training who is now managing global operations, or a lawyer or a judge who's involved in an international dispute, or any related working scenario that you can imagine, it's key to understand how culture may impact negotiations that you engage on behalf of your client, your constituents, your employer. Culture itself, let's wait a sec, let's go with this. Culture itself is the unwritten book with rules of the social game that is passed on from newcomers to the members of those who are in that particular group. So thus culture does not have the same rules from one culture to another culture. And when there are cultural differences, and we look at them side by side, there could be cross-cultural concerns which powerfully impact every negotiating opportunity. And how the cross-cultural concerns are addressed creates either minimizing or maximizing cultural risk. We need to successfully look at those concerns in a negotiation and be aware of the cultural expectations that can influence the deal or the resolution of a dispute. However, in our area of diversity and globalization, you look at culture, but at the same time, you have to be wary that culture doesn't set too many expectations and change the way that you behave. So our counterparts are complex people who won't necessarily follow their cultural scripts. Sometimes culture matters a lot, sometimes not at all. For example, envision the New York lawyer who was meeting with the vice president of MTV, the music TV station that's been around a long time, and it was MTV Japan. And he was meeting for the first time at a Soho hotel where the VP was staying. The lawyer, dressed in his most conservative suit, he brimmed with confidence as he saw the stylishly attired VP chatting with some musicians in the lobby. The lawyer approached him with a deep bow and traditional Japanese greetings of respect. The VP replied, "What's up with that, my man?" The lawyer felt a sinking sensation because he understood that he needlessly raised cultural barriers between himself and the VP that night. He should have also thought about the hotel choice, the Soho, the clothes that the person was wearing, the VP was wearing, which looked very Western, and his awkward attempted traditional Japanese manner that they might embarrass his guest. So when making judgment calls, we normally rely on schema, cognitive templates that provide low effort for ready-made answers, and that, is what we sometimes overread. Cultural schemas account for the distinctive behavioral biases exhibited by negotiators from a particular culture. Suppose that a buyer in a procurement negotiation is surprised by the new seller's high initial bid. She may wonder, is the seller trying to gouge me? Or does his product line require a higher bottom line? One core American cultural schema attributes behavior to personality. And so we basically think it's character. So if she follows the schema, she'll interpret the seller's high bid in terms of personal factors, such as he's being greedy, rather than in terms of situational factors, the seller's bargaining position. Other things that come into it are deadlines, distractions, emotional stressors, and accountability, all which cause us to rely more on these schemas because they're easy, and then we can kind of think about them and hopefully use them as we're pressed for time. So if we understand the triggering factors that cause us to look at the schemas, then we have to actually go beyond them and enable to figure out when is the cultural expectations that we have important and when should we ignore them. Now, we can shape the features of a negotiation to deal with some of the impact of culture in advance. We can maybe determine the location, the members of who comes to the negotiating table, the issues on the agenda, and so on. And with that, we can maybe reduce the possibility of cultural misunderstanding. At the bargaining table, we can also work to minimize demands on attention that might distract us, those emotional stressors I just talked about, and rely more on those cognitive cues that will help us enhance our culturally based thinking. Researchers do confirm that there is a relationship between national culture and negotiation style and success. There's an ongoing project by Northwestern University's Dispute Resolution Research Center. It's exploring the link between process and outcome, specifically how culture and cultural tendencies lead to certain process choices, which in turn can lead to better or worse negotiation results. One study that was undertaken by the center has found that negotiators from the United States typically communicate their priorities more directly than do their Japanese counterparts, an advantage at the bargaining table. Because Japanese negotiators, however, are good at making inferences, they match American performance in their ability to use information to generate joint gains. By contrast, negotiators from Hong Kong and Russia do not create as much value as either Americans or Japanese negotiators, though for quite different reasons. Hong Kong negotiators often fail to share enough information to identify beneficial trade-offs, while Russian negotiators tend to rely too much on power tactics. And you can see that these findings actually conform some of the familiar national stereotypes that we already have. But it would be a grave mistake to assume that group tendencies reliably predict any one individual's behavior. The important contribution of this research is that cultural differences in negotiation don't hinge precisely on where the negotiator happens to have been born, but rather they depend on what the negotiator actually does at the bargaining table. The ability to engage in constructive communication by revealing and interpreting information matters much more than the negotiator's passport. Even with common language and the best of intentions, negotiators from different cultures face special challenges. So some guidelines just to start us out in terms of preparing for talks with somebody from a different culture. First, research your counterpart's background and experience. With a little homework, you should be able to learn negotiating partner who they'll be, find out some details about her background and experience. If your counterpart has a great deal of international negotiating experience, you can probably assume that cultural stereotyping is likely to create less communication difficulties than you would see with somebody who might be new to the negotiating table. If you have trouble getting information about your negotiating partner, ask an intermediary with contacts at that organization or firm to make inquiries for you. Second, enlist an advisor from your counterpart's culture. If you discover that the person with whom you're likely to be negotiating has little or no international cross-cultural experience, enlist somebody from the culture to serve as the second during the negotiation. Rather than deferring to this advisor during the talks, plan out signals in advance to indicate when you should take a break for additional advice. In this manner, your cultural guide can help you size up the situation, coach you as needed, and even interject if she feels that you have made an egregious error or misinterpretation. Third, pay close attention to unfolding negotiation dynamics. Listen carefully. If you're unsatisfied with the answers that you receive, reframe your questions and try again. If you're unsure about what the other side has said, repeat what you think you've heard and get confirmation of it. It's safe to assume that people living and working in different cultural settings often view and interpret the same events differently. But in our era of globalization, it's also true that we have more in common on the person-to-person level than you might expect. So don't ignore your intuition and mind your manners. Most business professionals recognize that they need technical or legal expertise to proceed with deal-making interaction. Cross-cultural negotiators realize that they might have to size up the situation in advance, interpret signals and norms, and that could make the difference in making or breaking a negotiation. There's been extensive research in the past 50 years on understanding foreign culture, and I wanted to cover some of it for you, again, with the caveat that it's not going to necessarily be used in every situation and that we don't want to overly rely on it. So some of it, I want to cover with you some of the models that are out there. Now, they always say that it's important to consider things in behavior, such as eye contact, personal space and touch, time, meeting and greeting, and whether or not gift giving is important before you start a negotiation. You should also look at the basis of the relationship. Who should be at the bargaining table, and are there power imbalances that you have to address? Figure out how to deliver information. Figure out, if you can, the negotiating style of your opponent. Now, in comparing some of the cultural norms and values that are out there are often different senses of space and self. Mainstream American culture tends to value informal handshakes, for example. Other cultures might have formal hugs, bows, and again, handshakes, but maybe handshakes given in a different way. Communication and language is going to differ. Mainstream American culture makes explicit communication, direct communication with emphasis on content, meaning that is found in words. Other cultures often rely on implicit, indirect communication, emphasis on content and meaning found around words. So the words aren't actually communicating exactly what you think. Dress and appearance may differ. So in the United States, we dress for success. A wide range of accepted dress comes within that. Other cultures, dress might actually indicate a sign of position, wealth, prestige, and there could be religious rules that govern the dress. Food and eating habits. Mainstream American culture, eating is a necessity, and we often think about fast food as being a nutritious way of gaining one's meals. Other cultures, dining may be a social experience, and there could be religious rules. And whether you negotiate around food could very much differ from culture to culture. Time and time consciousness. So mainstream culture, we think of time as being linear, and most of us have time consciousness, value on promptness, time equals money. Other cultures, they might have a more elastic and relative time consciousness, and time spent on building the relationship is just as important. Relationships with family, friends, and others in the business, right? Focus, in the mainstream culture, it's usually on the nuclear family, responsibility for self, and value on youth. Age is sometimes, I hope not, seen as a handicap. Other cultures that focus on the extended family, loyalty and responsibility in the family, and age is given status and respect. Values and norms. Mainstream American culture values individual orientation and independence, preference for direct confrontation of conflict. Other cultures, there's group orientation, conforming to what the group says, and preference for harmony. Beliefs and attitudes. American culture is egalitarian. Challenging of authority is expected. Individuals control their destiny, and we're working toward gender equity. Other cultures could be much more hierarchical, respect for authority and social order. Individuals sometimes expect their destiny, and they have different roles for men as they do for women. Mental processes and learning style. Mainstream American culture is linear, logical, sequential, a problem-solving focus. Other cultures tend to be more lateral, holistic, simultaneous, accepting of life's difficulties. Work habits and practices. We emphasize the task. Reward is based on individual achievement, and work itself has intrinsic value. Other cultures, they emphasize relationships. Relationships are based on seniority, and work is a necessity of life. Okay, so this, again, it wasn't necessarily quite the polar that all other cultures, clearly I was not saying that, but, you can expect to see some of those things in some of the cultures that are out there, and each one of those would vary from culture to culture. So what we have to do basically when we're going into any kind of negotiating or mediating situation, we have to sketch the situation. This is called the Cirrus approach. Identify the interests and issues for all the parties. Research the details, not only the positions and interests, but also the cultural expectations and how cross-culture might influence the negotiation. formulate how I'm going to represent my client, envision the interaction that's going to occur during that negotiation or mediation, and arrange the site. All right, so let's look back at some of the more details then of the studies that are out there. And I'm going to present 4 studies that have said this, starting with the oldest one that is out there. So we have Kluckholm and Stadbeck, and they raised 6 questions to members of mostly business. Most of the research is done in the business field and comes out of universities and their business departments. So that's what we're going to be seeing, that most of the research is done not on lawyers negotiating, but business deals being negotiated. So here they were looking at members of a cultural group who had orientations toward the world and other people. And they studied that by asking questions of them. So the first question that they asked is, what is the nature of people? And they gave 3 options. It's either good, evil, or it's a mixture of good and evil. So good means you're optimistic about other people's motivations and capabilities. Evil means you're pessimistic, you're suspicious of your peers, your partners, and you're secretive. And the mixture then combines both of those, sometimes resulting in a conflict. You might have optimistic attitudes for behavior, but then you might actually vet the actual response to see whether it's accurate, as if you're suspicious of it. The second question they ask is, what is the person's relationship to nature? And it's either dominant or harmony or subjugation. So dominant means you have control and planning. You impose one's will on the natural environment. And on business environment, you work to mold the organizational culture. Harmony means you coexist, you search for common ground, you do not like conflict within the workplace, and you respect the difference of others. And subjugation means you're fairly fatal. You accept external control, you are averse to independent planning, and you're pessimistic about changing anything, particularly in organizational culture. Third area that they explored was, what was the person's relationship to other people? You're linear or hierarchical, respect for authority or seniority determined by either age or family or gender. Collateral, relationships within the group are more collaborative, and the attitudes towards superiors and other groups are more on a even level. Members of other groups, though it's very much tribe-y, are treated with suspicion, and structures and systems remove the individual from the group, break down those group boundaries, are disliked. And individualistic, people primarily perceive themselves as individuals rather than members of a group. And you need to maximize opportunities for personal achievement and status. The fourth area that they asked about, and that should say number 4, is the modality of human activity: doing, being, or containing. Doing is performance is valued, and so financial and other measures of performance are valued. Work is central to the life, and there's a very practical orientation toward work. Any ambiguity that frustrates your ability to perform in the work environment causes anxiety. Being, status is not derived from work, but it's derived from birth, age, sex, family, your connections, rather than your achievement. Feelings are valued, but planning is short-term, spontaneity is valued. And containing, focus on self-control, striving for balance between feeling and doing. What is the temporal focus of human activity? Future or present or past. Future, basically we're looking, past performance is less valued, and change is valued, and career planning and training are valued. Present, immediate realities are prioritized and used as the basis for planning. Long-term plans are liable to be modified, and there's an emphasis on contemporary impact. And the past is used as a model when planning the future. There's a respect for precedents, a need for continuity, and a respect paid to age. And the last one is the conception of space: private, public, or mixed. So private is personal ownership. What is private is valued. Private meetings are valued. Strangers are kept at a distance. Public, activities are conducted in secret or held with suspicion. Social proximity is taken for granted, and public meetings are valued. And mixed, you have both public and private activities. All right, so that's the first one that starts to divide us by culture, the first study that starts to divide us by culture. The second study that started to divide us by culture was in 1976 and started to look at a high context model versus a low context model. And it demonstrated the influences of context functioning in different cultures. So high context is a communication or message in which most of the information is already in the person, while very little is coded. It's explicitly transmitted as part of the message. So it lays out a series of the characteristics are relationships are long-lasting, individuals feel deep personal involvement with each other, there's a shared code that defines communication, and so communications, both written and oral, are economical, fast, and efficient. In high context culture, they explore the communicative context. Communication is verbal, sometimes nonverbal, using signaling and non-signaling utterances. People in authority feel personally responsible for their actions of the subordinates. There's loyalty between superiors and subordinates. In the high context culture, often things, again, are spoken and not written. A contract is seen as only a best guess. The distinct difference between insiders and outsiders is very much distinguished. Outsiders are non-members of the family, non-members of the clan, non-members of the organization, and those who are foreign to the culture. And the cultural patterns of a high-context culture are deeply ingrained in its members, so they're very slow to change. Now, the low-context model, relationships between individuals are relatively shorter in duration, and deep personal involvement with others is not valued as highly. Communicated messages are explicit, with the sender depending very little on the receiver inferring any of the message from the context. There's much less use of nonverbal communication. Members of these cultures often feel that explicit, logical structures are best for presenting ideas. Authority is diffused throughout the bureaucratic system, and personal responsibility is difficult to pin down. Agreements are written and not spoken. Contracts are seen as final expressions of the relationship and are legally binding. Sometimes those contracts then are obsessed by, so thinks a high context culture, looking at the low context culture. The difference between outsiders and insiders is much more fluid, and there's less of that distinction and less of an ability to try to keep people out. And cultural patterns are changed easily and change fairly quickly in shorter periods of time. All right, then we have the third research looks at 5 different areas: power, distance, individual collectivism, masculinity, femininity, tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, and Confucian dynamism. So let's look at each of those for a second. So the power distance one, that's the distance between individuals at different levels of hierarchy. Each culture tends to teach its people how to manage themselves when they encounter that hierarchy. And how you then deal with that puts you on this scale. The extent which less powerful members of organizations and institutes accept and expect that power is distributed unequally, that makes a high power difference. So basically where you have a high hierarchical society where the people at the bottom accept their position and accept the authority over them, that would be a high power. And that inequality is not seen as inequality. It might come with destiny. Now, the low power is that we expect to be consulted, and we can change our power differential. We can move up the ladder. Individualism or collectivism. So that's the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups, or whether the individual then stands on their own and is seen as validating their own accomplishments. And so on the collectivist side, we find societies in which people from birth are integrated into strong, cohesive groups, often extended families with uncles, aunts, and grandparents, which continue to protect them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. Collectivism, in this sense, it doesn't have a political meaning. It refers to the group, not to the state. And the issue is addressed by all parts of the world. Basically, we have somewhere on this scale, we've decided this is a major category. So as we look at the collectivism, the group interests prevail. Each individual finds his identity through the group. Individuals' loyalty to the group is valued, and competition between groups will exist. And the individual side of the spectrum, a person will achieve for himself to meet his or her needs. Managers are expected to work hard for their rewards. Competition is expected. Individual decisions are valued over group decisions. Manager will aim for a variety rather than conformity in the workplace. Loyalty to the corporation is not absolute and only exists until loyalty does not suit the individual. Rebellion against conformity is clearly accepted within bounds, and the capacity for altruism through extensive volunteer activities. Okay, then we have the masculine-femininity distinction. This is the division of roles and values in society, and whether that actually makes a difference. So we have an IBM study revealed that women's values differ less among societies than men's values as a whole. Men's values from one country to another contain a dimension from very assertive, competitive, that are maximally different from women's values on one side to modest and caring, and similar to women's values on the others. That assertive pole has been seen then as masculine and feminine. So if we think about it in a negotiation, some of the studies are out there ask, if you were negotiating against a woman, what do you expect the negotiation style would be? And some of the adjectives that we see as we study all groups on this, we see that the women's style is trustworthy, compromising, sympathetic, friendly, even-tempered, tough, distributive, combative, eager to take advantage, persistent, fair, intuitive, collaborative, more open to communication, less likely to ask for things, creative, a peacemaker, cooperative. So you can see that there's elements in there a little bit of some of the things that we might think for a man, but usually you're getting kind of that competitive, cooperative side. Hesitant, simple, honest, professional, responsive, smart, more attention to detail. And then when we do that same question, if you were to negotiate a man, what would you expect his negotiation style to be? Dishonest, hard bargainer, same as a woman, aggressive, more style over substance, interrogative, easygoing, assertive, competitive, guarded, more willing to bluff, demanding, cold, bottom line driven, unable to pick up on a client's emotional cues, bullying, adversarial, would take advantage of a female client, confident, boys club mentality, concerned with reputation, not detail-oriented, intimidating, slimy. Okay, so that's just, basically they give this questions over and over again, and these are the adjectives that you gather at a higher level from groups. Okay, so what do we see in a culture for that? When you have the masculinity side, its sex roles in the workplace are clearly differentiated. The societal ideal is performance of your work duty. The top priority is given to maintenance of economic growth. Men are to be competitive and assertive. Women are to be tender and able to take care of relationships. And when you have the femininity side of this goal, sex roles are less sharply defined as reflected in a wide range of work available to members of the culture regardless of sex. In the family, the parent who is better paid is the one who works regardless of sex. Corporation must not interfere with family life of its employees. Achievement is measured in terms of human contacts rather than in terms of power and property. Relating to one another is valued over competition. Individual brilliance is suspect. And an outsider and an anti-hero are regarded sympathetically. Yeah, so what happened to that? It went forward with me. You didn't tell me it was going forward. All right, so now here we have tolerance for ambiguity. Okay, so more or less, we try to either accept the future or avoid the future because of the ambiguity it creates. And each culture directs how a member is going to adapt to uncertainty. If you have a low tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, it basically indicates that you feel uncomfortable with unstructured situations. The unstructured situations are novel, unknown, surprising, and different from usual. Uncertainty avoiding cultures try to minimize the possibility of such situations by strict laws and rules, safety and security measures, and on the philosophical and religious level, in a belief in absolute truth. There can only be one truth, and we have it. So those kind of cultures, we have high anxiety about uncertainty in the workplace, low level of willingness to take on risks. Risk is broadly defined as something that's not expected. Expert managers are valued over those who facilitate the work of those that they manage. So that means, so if you have expertise, that creates certainty. Clear work rules are valued. Precise job descriptions are valued. Entrepreneurial behavior is not valued. Job security is fundamental, and career planning is part of the education of each member of society. There's a clear retirement plan expected for each worker. Now, on the uncertainty side of it, the low level of avoidance, individuals have lower level anxiety and stress in the workplace. There's a willingness to take risks. There's an entrepreneurial activity that's encouraged and valued. Changes in the workplace that move the work forward is valued. Managers who are facilitators are valued. There's little value in loyalty to a boss. And foreigners can be effective as managers and are fairly easily accepted by the workforce. All right, and finally, we have this long-term versus short-term orientation. This is still all coming out of this Gersard's research. This dimension looks at whether or not we are going to be oriented to the future, in particular perseverance and thrift, or whether we are going to be oriented on a much shorter term. So some of the characteristics again. Cultures with long-term orientation have persistence. Relationships are placed in order by status, and this order is followed. They have a sense of shame. If you have short-term orientation, you have personal steadiness and stability. You try to protect one's face. You have a respect for tradition, and there's often reciprocation in terms of greetings, favors, and gifts. All right, so these are the countries that were studied, and just to give you that there's a list. And this is the kind of charting that is done. So basically, this is the chart that compares uncertainty avoidance versus power distance. And the United States is kind of sitting there with a lot of the European countries on the lower right-hand. We're in the top. We're with Canada. We're just starting in the upper left quadrant on this. The ones in the lower right-hand corner are Yugoslavia, Mexico, Panama, so a lot of the South American countries. So obviously too small for us to really learn from, but it's out there. Now this is the chart that shows how we behave on the individualism versus the masculinity femininity index. And here the United States is sitting in, let me see, where are we? USA, in the lower right-hand corner, and we're there with Great Britain and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and Germany and Ireland and Italy and Switzerland. Up on the far left-hand, opposite us, are Yugoslavia, China, Turkey, Brazil, Guatemala. Okay, so you can see that there are these cultural distinctions over these categories that we talked about. And how do we score on something? So the United States, just to give you, they did score our scores versus all the rest of those countries, and I only gave you the one for Japan. You can see that, let me tell you what that means. So for the first score, which is the power distance, we're a 40, they're a 57. So what does that mean? Basically, we look at the second one. We're a 91, they're a 46, because that's a larger distinction here. So that's on the individualism, collectivism. We have a much more, and this is common sense, individualistic attitude and relatively loose bonds with others. We're more self-reliant, and we look out for ourselves and our close family members, whereas Japan is much more collective about that group culture and keeping outsiders out. If we look at the masculinity, femininity, we're pretty low on that, meaning that we're kind of in the middle, whereas Japanese is highly in the masculine role of it. So you can see these differences out there on any of these categories that are going to influence the way that we negotiate. Okay, one more study. This basically talks about a universalist culture versus a particularist culture. A universalist culture is one where individuals tend to rely on what is legal, and what is legal takes precedence over details of a situation, the context. A particularist culture, the relationship determines how you'll act in a particular situation. All right, so now what are we going to do with this? So let's just take one culture as an example again. This comes from a study that compares Japanese negotiators to American negotiators. The Japanese negotiators' status relationships are very important, and so they're high on that power distance. Buyers have more status than sellers, but buyers look out for the seller's interests. The focus is on the long term and on the relationship, not the immediate contract. In fact, again, that contract is seen as being malleable, not necessarily fixed in stone. The Japanese want to maintain harmony, and it's more important than getting to the deal. Decision-making is made by consensus. Important concessions are made before the formal meeting, where the informal agreement is merely ratified, and that saves face. So you basically, before the meeting, the negotiation even happens, the deal is done. So you have to have a lot of emissaries that are creating the deal first, and then the people in power come in to ratify it. The Japanese basically never say no. They might say it's inconvenient, but they mean no. So you have to know that that's exactly what's going on. It's not that it's just a counteroffer. They discuss issue holistically and see negotiation as an inductive process. A contract is the beginning of negotiations and a furthering of the relationship. Okay, so now where are we on this? Status relationships are not as important. Status is based on what you do, not who you are. Buyers and sellers have equal status, and we believe buyer beware. Focus is on the short term and on the contract, not the relationship. Maintaining harmony is more important than the deal. The deal, so that actually says the reverse. The deal is more important than maintaining harmony, because Japanese value the harmony, we value the deal. Decision-making is individualistic. Important concessions and negotiation can occur at the formal meeting. Doesn't have to just be a ratification. We won't accept no as an answer, so if we hear no, we're going to be countering that, thinking that there's still some movement to be made. There's the sequential deductive negotiations process, and contract represents the end of the negotiations and determines the relationship. All right, so first thing I want you to do is I have a assess your negotiating style. So I want you to kind of do a quick read of this and then maybe take a few minutes to discuss your negotiating style with your table members. So why don't you just take just 2 minutes and kind of dialogue about where you were on the scale and whether you're all kind of on the same page in terms of our negotiating style, or are there differences even at the table? And what we would do with this kind of assessment, of course, is try to do this with our opponent, have them assess their negotiating style, and see whether we have some of the differences across that table that we might have to be aware of.
We'll count from the left. Hi, Jerry.
Well, Lori, where were you on contract?
Mine was 2.
Let's do 1 through 5. Attitudes, 5.
Yeah,
See, she's tougher than
more realistic.
personal style for 2.
Exactly. I know there's some things.
I hear you go 1.
Well, I mean, now, someone would say this is accurate.
Communications and
That's what you do. Media.
But you can see how she says other companies are different. You might be totally direct, but you say, how can I be non-direct but direct at the same time? Right. Most of us are in the middle. It's your job. You should be all the way to the middle. Specific agreements have all the way to the bottom. If you're going to have a contract, or bottom line, figure out what you need, agree on.
Top down.
I was thinking you got the details, you can plug it in.
Well, that's, I think it's like an outside in versus inside. My wife is definitely white.
Is there a certain thing, somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to be in charge and make the final decision. But to make the best decision, you should be able to get input from
I don't know. You know, live for the top gun fight.
So that you can avoid.
Never too late.
And they're not talking about that. It's the
a nice.
Yes. Quite interesting. That's part of my job.
I wonder how that's gonna compare.
Yeah.
Okay, I have two volunteers who are going to come up here. Jen, you can't sit down again, you have to be up here.
I'm not done reading that.
Yeah, I know you are.
Okay.
You can. So they're reading their scripts, but I'm gonna give you both of their scripts so that you see. They're gonna negotiate a Japanese publication between a school teacher and the head of a Japanese school who wants to get this publication out, and the other is what. And then we will. You have two. You have two papers. I'm giving you two papers. So this is that you must have.
Time to discuss.
Oh, there you go.
See, we get both.
Yeah.
2 hours. Grab another roll. It must be a high energy. How many clerks do you have? 2. Is that standard?
Some people have 3, no.
And is it still 2 year?
Well, a lot of us do. From
Ah,
seminaries.
that didn't used to be. Although Judge Wayne was probably the first one, we had Jeff Wickham there.
Yes, yeah.
Clerk for life. Definitely. And that's because they worked so closely. They were friends also. Did you do your own recruiting for your rotating one, or is there
Well,
an administrator that brings in candidates? Oh, you do? Wow, people, yeah. first round.
Yeah, you're good.
Because I want my margins.
Okay.
Get all the subtlety, and he wants the competition.
Oh, yeah.
All right, can everybody see them? Okay. They don't have mics, so you'll have to speak way up.
We yell at each other.
You should pick the two best dressed.
Right. Okay, I'm just gonna dig in.
Dig in.
Okay. Well, thank you for sitting down and talking with me about this matter. I just had some concerns about, our discussions over the manuscript, and wondered if we could talk a little bit more about it.
Yes, I think we do need to talk about it.
We met several days ago, and you had asked that I, take a look at it to see about doing some editing. And I certainly took the time to do that and just wanted to see, if there was anything else I could look at, or if there was a way that we could work through some of those edits.
Well, I think we will need to do that, Scott. I think that I trusted you with this very important assignment, that I have a lot of respect for your work, and that's why I asked you to do this for us.
Thank you.
I want you to think about the men who wrote this manuscript and how hard they worked on it, and how these gentlemen expected that their work was the finest that they would put out. And these edits that you've suggested just don't seem to appreciate that effort and their position. How am I going to explain that to these gentlemen?
So I certainly, in doing the edits, I certainly didn't mean any form of disrespect. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for you being in this position, and enjoy this position working here and doing this job. I think what is difficult, though, is that I think we also want to put forth a product in this book that that accurately, reflects the language, and that the sentences and the work in the book is grammatically correct and accurate as to the language. So when I was working on the edits, that was certainly something that I wanted to consider in doing that. And it wasn't that I was trying to show any level of disrespect. And I hope that that's not how it came across. I wanted to make sure it was also accurate.
I see. Well, we still need your signature. And what you just explained to me makes some sense. What does not make sense to me is that you will not sign the endorsement. And why is that? Why such difficulties?
Again, it is certainly not, I don't want it to appear that I'm being disrespectful with this signature. It's more what I was trying to express, that, I think in endorsing it, I want to feel that I'm able to say that these sentences and this expression of the language is correct and accurate in its usage. So it is a difficult position to be in, to be able to sign that when, based on my background, there are some inaccuracies or perhaps some portions of it that could still use a little bit more work.
Scott, you know the consequences if you do not sign this endorsement, don't you?
And it's a difficult way to look at it.
Are you prepared to accept those consequences?
Is there any other possible manner that we can have some more time to look through or discuss this with the lawyers?
Well, we both knew the deadline, and you accepted the assignment as I expected that you would. The time is not now for us to further consider this. The time is for you to sign the endorsement. We need this, Scott.
I understand where you're coming from on that it's necessary and that, and we want to be respectful of the writers and their work on this.
Okay, this is good. This is good. All right, so this particular simulation is actually, as a law professor, something that I'm going to go through this afternoon. I'm meeting with, for an SJD candidate with my student from Kuwait. And he has written his first chapter, and I don't understand it. And basically, it needs entire translation into English. So this is basically showing, and he believes I'm disrespecting him because I need to edit it. But I can't sign my name to it. And so we had already, last week, a 3-hour negotiation about the manuscript that he's about to do. But negotiations across cultures are difficult. And what we're showing here is basically an American editor who is trying to get, the Japanese would like just to have her signature on it. She's unwilling to do that because her name is going on it. And we have to figure out how to cross that cultural bound to meet both persons' expectations. So thank you very much for it. I guess my last word, because we're basically there today, is that you have to be ready for these cultural discontinuities, but at the same time not, again, overread them and go with the flow and the situation and the individuals rather than do too much. There's particular risk in the ethical area where we overread the ethics of another culture or the lack of ethics. I mentioned that at the beginning, thinking somebody is being greedy versus thinking maybe what's going on here is just a negotiating tactic or positional bargaining. So thank you for joining me today, and have a great Tuesday. Thank you for helping me.
Good luck, Jane.
Yeah.